Go with your countdown. Welcome, everyone. Happy Thursday. Come on in. I'm excited to be here with Fatimah. As you're coming in, we do have a fun poll going, so definitely jump in and tell us which of these would be the hardest to live without. And whatever you pick, you got to say what your favorite of that thing is. But thanks for joining us, everyone. We're going to give a couple minutes for people to trickle in, so grab some water, coffee, whatever you need to get comfy, and we'll kick off our discussion in a few minutes. So let us know your phone. Yeah. If you said music, you got to say what type of music. As I was picking this question, I was struggling to decide what I would pick. All of them. What would you say?
The phone does all of them, right? You know,
it's true.
Except chocolate. So maybe.
I do feel like the phone is a cop-out answer. Like it gives you music, gives you TV streaming.
Yeah. I think I would say music for sure. Music is like the soundtrack of life.
Yes. No, I listen to music so much. I don't know how I would do any activities without listening to something. No, 100%. Awesome. We got a lot of folks jumping in. Let us know where you're calling in from. I'm calling in from sunny Boston. Getting kind of cold for fall. Yeah, music is the soundtrack to so many good memories. That is true.
Yeah.
I do love listening to a song and being transported back to a memory.
Yeah.
Amazing. Yep. Tell us where you're calling in from. Let us know what you're excited to hear. Nice turkey. Very cool. Hi, Alice. Love Boston. Amazing. Keep answering that poll. I'm so curious what people say. We'll get started in just another minute. Amazing. Looks like phone will probably win this poll. I'll be more curious about the later polls. We have some good questions.
Spicy question. You have to say which type of chocolate. Is it Swiss chocolate? Like what percentage of?
Yes. Is it dark? Is it milk?
Is it milk?
Yeah, and if it's TV, what show?
Right.
I'll follow up with people here.
These questions need to be asked. These are the questions we need to ask in our field. Chocolate or music?
Right. This is what people want to know. What will drive their day-to-day life. Amazing. All right. Well, as fun as it would be to just chit chat about chocolate all day, we have a lot to talk about. So I want to say welcome, everyone. These AMAs are the best part of my month, and I'm so excited to have Fatimah here. I've been following her for a long time, and this discussion will be really great. Before we get started, just for those, many of you are not strangers to the AMA series we do, but for those that are new, we like to keep it casual, keep it a discussion. We really care to make it engaging. So we have a lot of questions set up, but we will, of course, defer to any questions you all have. So please drop your questions in the chat throughout. I have my colleague Sydney in the background. She'll be monitoring those. And we'll do our best to get to those questions, but just know we have lots to chat about and can't always get to all of them. Before we introduce Fatimah, I'm Lauren from Rally. I run content marketing. You've probably seen me often. But a little about Rally quickly. We're a research ops platform that removes the pain of recruitment and study management to help you talk to your users at scale and make faster and better product decisions. So you can definitely check it out later. But the more exciting thing to talk about is Fatimah. So if you'd like to introduce yourself, that'd be awesome.
Yeah. Well, hi. I'm really excited to be here and chat about my experience and 20 years of experience. So I started off in engineering operations. Spent about 15 plus years in user research, leading teams. I started as a research assistant, went into enterprise research, so studying B2B products, B2B solutions. I studied applied anthropology, design, and a whole lot of things in grad school, critical theory. And now I have shifted to what I call a UXR Strategist, which is primarily supporting research initiatives around research integration, insight initiatives, things like that. So I'm here to chat about all things, user experience maturity. It is only my perspective, so this is a bit of a disclaimer. If you want to drop off, no, I would not feel bad. But this is all just my perspective over 20 years and some of the observations around the discussions with research maturity. It's not representative of any of my companies that I've worked at, which have been amazing, but this is just Fatima's like rant about research maturity with Lauren. So yeah, my hope is that, everyone will feel inspired to kind of go back to their team and workshop any critical perspectives we talk about today, because every team is different when it comes to maturity. It's just one of those topics you can't really just say this is how everyone is. And at a minimum, hopefully it'll lead to some self-reflection as researchers in our own workflow and our practices, or even some juicy debates. So I'm excited.
I love a good juicy debate. I'm here for the spice. I know we were saying we need just spice emojis to be flying up in this chat.
Spicy emojis is possible. That'll be happy.
Throw them in the chat, everyone. Amazing. So before we dive in, I'd love to hear a little more about your current focus and kind of how your journey in UX has evolved over the years. Like, I know you've had a long career, so I'd love to dive into that a little more.
Yeah, I think the last 5 years, I've started to shift my focus just slightly in research. So instead of strategic research programs, which are these programs that kind of go horizontal across product topics that still kind of support design and product decisions, I've now shifted to supporting strategic systems and for UXR initiatives, empathy building programs, things that just really amplify the research strategy. So working closer with the research leadership team and leads. I think that's been incredibly fulfilling. I've had the opportunity I didn't know what to expect when I took the pivot. Honestly, I was just really inspired, like everyone else, by Kate and the reemergence of research operations. I felt like I've always had a close, research operations has always been dear to my heart, because as a research assistant, I kind of got put in that role with lab operations 20 years ago. I've always felt like they were the unsung heroes of our field that a lot of people don't talk about. And they also just make you feel seen as a researcher, because there's so much that goes on in the research life cycle that the company and that your partners don't know about. So it's just I've always just been inspired by, I call myself a fan of research operations. So I took a pivot to kind of see what was going on there. And it was just eye-opening. I've had the opportunity to report to different types of leaders. So instead of research leaders, research operation leaders, UX operation leaders, even leaders who have business operations background. And that was kind of the big aha about our research structure, just stepping out of that path of execution only and looking back and saying, oh, wow, I didn't know there was a leak there. I didn't know it was a crack there. I didn't know we didn't have any scaffolding at the top of our, organization. So that's what really inspired me to, raise my hand and step up and say, hey, I think senior researchers have a point of view when it comes to research operations and how we support strategic research, especially those meaty, sticky topics like ethics and safety and things like that. A little less about the execution and planning and budgeting, but a lot happens after you do that research report, especially if it's really juicy and political and what I call a wicked problem flower. But even as you grow as a team, right? You go from maybe one researcher, a team of one, to a large global team with, across a complex company and product landscape. Things just change. There's a lot more support that's needed, as the team grows. And so I got really inspired by that, inspired by Emma's discussion around organizational context. That was the first time I even seen us talk about the organizational context of research. I saw a lot about design, but as a research team, there are some unique needs there as well. So that's why I've made that shift over the last 5 years, and it's definitely been interesting.
Yeah, to say the least, politely. Yeah, and I know we've kind of touched on a little how like your approach to strategic research has shifted, but curious like what else has kind of caused that shift and what kind of opened your eyes to that more?
Well, I started my career in engineering operations. So I started just like any other computer science, grad trying to get to Silicon Valley. It's like a gold rush of computer science graduates trying to get here. So I was there too. So I started at Lockheed Martin in space and aviation. And so I worked in defense IT. And in that environment, I'm not sure if it's the culture of engineering or the culture of space and aviation, but operations is a bit more no nonsense. It's a little bit more enforcement, compliance, and accountability should anything go wrong, which we have a lot of examples of that in aviation, right? And so as soon as I made that transition to study UX, it was just the first thing I saw. So this point of view I've always had for 15 years, just like, where's the accountability? Where's the enforcement? Because some of the output could be pretty critical, just like in aviation and space. And in those situations, sometimes it impacted the kind of contracts you received, like capability maturity models looked at, how capable you are with building this machinery. I think we need to do the same thing now that the product landscape is starting to shift from, internet and hardware to these other products. The outputs could be pretty critical, and I just don't see that level of compliance. And that started the juicy part, the spicy part of the journey 15 years ago. And I started asking all these questions to leaders. At the time, people don't realize 20 plus years ago, it wasn't like this formal, polished UX organization. It usually was a mix of usability engineering, industrial psychology. It was just a lot of mix and matching of human computer interaction disciplines. And so I was asking leaders in engineering, like, where's the accountability? And that's when it just got really sticky. That's when I realized that UX had a different mission in the beginning, which was to establish itself, which was to build those working relationships. The reemergence of reops kind of said, well, Kate, fresh off Kate's book, I know I'm not the only one that's like nose deep in her book,
So
right?
good.
But it was just a breath of fresh air for someone to like really critically reflect on how we're positioning Emma as well with the 8 pillars. So that became really inspiring. It also showed me that former UXRs have a say in this research operation and organizational context. And there may be some tools that we may not be tapping into, especially if you study like enterprise UX, where you're studying how organizations build products. So in my graduate studies, I ended up going into more critical theory of technology and design in societies, critical reflexivity, the different organizations, the culture of engineering and how it produces. So if you're familiar with like Bruno Latar's work, and there are a lot of folks in the industry that have even applied this, and they're always also studying this. But thinking of things like decision making and organizational dynamics and power dynamics. And so as I learned this throughout my studies, I'd always come back to work and like, hey, what about the power dynamics? Anyone who's worked with me is probably laughing because that's exactly what I like to talk about when those 101, like when they say, get to know your teammate, tell me about your power dynamics, that's work. But I loved it because it did even though it had nothing to do with necessarily the project we were working on, it led to a lot of reflecting in our practice, and it was very enjoyable and everyone enjoyed it. But there was actually no outlet, I think, for us like research operations to kind of apply that. And so I just think that now this inflection point that's happening is just very ripe for a lot of senior researchers with those critical theory backgrounds or engineering operations or other mature operations can really beef up our research strategy when it comes to, supporting that meaty, juicy, strategic type of insight that goes across the company. And I do just want to still, acknowledge a few people. I think if you check out Advancing Research 2024 this year, there's a lot of discussions around or the organizational context. So Robin Beers talks about that. Nalini from Salesforce, she moved research out of UX and has a strong, interesting perspective. I think Melissa and Denise, they talk about product operations being kind of a space for looking at that. And then there's just tons of academic research, from critical HCI to critical UX that talks about it as well. So all that really inspired my academic roots coming from aviation and space, where capability maturity models are really no nonsense. You either apply that to your production or you don't. And research operations, the work that Kate has done is just amazing. And research operations community too. So those are all my shout outs. I hope I got them all out, but that's why I'm inspired. And that's why thank you, gratitude.
Yeah, no, there's so many good shout outs to give in the research community. And I love hearing the backgrounds of like everyone, and not that research is unique in this way as an industry, but it's so interesting to hear how people bring their unique backgrounds into research and research ops. Because there's just, it's so interesting. So I loved hearing that background and how you got there. So a big topic of the CMA is strategic research intelligence. And I'd love to hear why the topic of maturity and research intelligence is so important to you.
Well, yeah. So point of clarification. When I talk about intelligence in this context, I'm speaking more about operational insights. So insight into how the research team is operating, not necessarily about informing product decisions with product analytics and trends and strategic foresight, but it's also about informing the integration and activation of insights. So I think it's really important for any UXR strategy, which is a formal business strategy, to understand the headwinds, to understand the blockers or the threats to the strategy internally. And so that is what I'm talking about. How do we gather that information so we can really beef up our UXR advocacy aspect? I think, like I mentioned, we have a lot of tools, but I'm not sure that we're sharpening them and using them in different nuanced ways in our career path. So this is also an opportunity for, existing, team members like senior researchers and existing tools on your research strategy to apply to, gathering this intelligence. So building support systems is something, if you personify it, right? You talk about being a person with a support system. You feel more confident as you navigate through life, right? Navigate through those hard situations. And I think we've done a great job, both leaders, operations folks, with helping us execute more efficiently. If you just start at research report, there's a ton of support that's needed there after you actually communicate it. And there's a huge desire, even a broad desire beyond design for those insights, especially those critical kind of must-haves around like user safety and ethics and inclusion. There's a broader audience for that besides the designer that you may work with. It's like, yes, and who else, right? And I think we need a little bit more strategic support. And maturity discussions are great, but they're still from that design lens, So if you narrow it to that design only, you miss out on those broad stakeholders or potential stakeholders that might be interested in that feedback. I think it's an urgent discussion for us to move beyond that because, one, we've spent a lot of time, at least over 20 years. People who've been in this field beyond 20 years know more than I do, but they've probably seen this as well. We've been talking about maturity for a long time, like 20 years. And imagine talking to someone for 20 years about maturing, and they'll be like, okay, now I'm 20. What do I do now? Okay, I've matured. And I think the conversation is like, what next with that maturity discussion? Let's say you have all the data about your projects. What type of critical questions are you asking about them, right? What are you asking about the organization? What does it matter if you don't have access to your users as quickly as possible? How does that impact velocity, right? Once you do your research, what does it matter that, a decision was made or not, what impact does it have if you don't make any decisions from those insights? And I think because as we move into these different product landscapes that have huge implications to the user, we need to start asking ourselves, okay, now that we're making the teams more mature, how intelligent are we making organizations? How wise are we making them? And what's blocking that? Especially if you just start with those critical must-have buckets around like user safety and privacy and inclusion. That's something that everyone can get on board about, right? And so what is blocking that? That's like that layer of critical intelligence that I'm saying we need to add to the maturity conversation, because if not, we're going to keep going, I think, gathering a lot of nice to have insight and quite frankly, not everyone, buys into the idea of maturity. It's not always a healthy conversation. And so I think when you get to how wise are we making companies, that's something that everyone can get behind, because why would you want to be a company that isn't learning, right? So I think it is urgent just because of the urgent times we're in, the crazy landscape that, we're all just, moving into the future very quickly. It's also a responsible way of advocating. So the maturity discussions now, I think, set us up. Again, they did exactly what they should have done 20 years ago with establishing us as a research team through the lens of design. I think the way that we challenge ourselves as researchers is the responsibility of advocating for those insights. I've always felt throughout my time and even observing across the industry that we just didn't put enough accountability on the maturity discussions. It was almost like a consumption. So the output was more like consuming, oh, okay, this is where I am, level 5, level 3, right? In complex organizations, they can vary. Some people could be at 1, some people could be at 2, some people could be at 5. So what does it mean? It's not just one level for one type of team. It's just much more complex. And I think a lot of people in complex organizations know exactly what I'm talking about, right? So the responsibility of advocacy isn't just to read which level you're at. Is to know, okay, what is the impact if you are at 1 and you're working on something that has a massive amount of insights related to ethics and trust, So that's a critical question that I think especially senior researchers, especially with organizational development, critical theory backgrounds, can add a layer to that maturity discussion and up-level it to more like how intelligent or not is the team becoming over certain topics. So that's what I mean by intelligence. I hope it's clear by that and why it's urgent and how it beefs up our advocacy, and even could say that's our responsibility to advocate for these things, like insights that are critical and meaty, and get that strategic support system. I just see a gap in it, to be quite frank. And I see that we're not maximizing, I think, some of the research skill sets that we have on our team. And so that's what really inspires me about it.
Amazing. I feel like there's so much to unpack there. We do have a poll going, and I'd love to pull it up and see what you think about it. If you have any thoughts, a lot of folks are answering. It's kind of interesting to see.
Yeah, somewhat, and I think that's interesting, right? Should it be somewhat? I was thinking about this commercial from back in the day that was like, I forget what it was. It was like, it's 9 a.m. Where are your kids or something like that. It was one of those old school, like 80 PSAs, but it's the same thing. It's 9:22 a.m. here on the West Coast. Do you know where your insights are? Like, you should know where your insights are, especially related to ethics, safety, and trust. Those are serious topics that researchers or research teams or a portfolio of researchers shouldn't be unaware of, especially decision makers. So I want to be clear, I am targeting a little bit more on the decision maker side, which is another gap that I don't see us really focusing on, is that there are much more leaders sitting at the table. How is that decision making going? Are you talking about where those insights are? If you can't talk about it, why not? Because these are critical things that, again, go beyond just our primary stakeholders. I'm pretty sure most corporate operations and business operations and inclusion teams would love to know the answer to this as well, not just designers. So
Totally. Amazing. So in the topic of intelligence, I'm curious what type of measures provide this intelligence that you're talking about for user research strategies. What can people kind of be looking at to figure that out?
Yeah, I always tell people, and I talk about this in more detail in my advancing research topic presentation that I presented in March. So I don't want to spoil it too much because it's like an hour-long presentation.
Okay, no spoilers.
But at a high level, there are like buckets that I see missing from a traditional project tracker. A lot of us have project trackers. So if you're thinking right now, Fatimah, I'm already tracking my projects. I know everything about them. I even know the number of decisions or insights or whatever. There's a few that I've seen after looking at number of trackers that I've worked on or just working close to leaders, even that I see across the LinkedIn chatter. It's like we're missing information about the environment. The thing that Emma Bhutan is talking about, the organizational context. Do you have measures, multiple measures around the stability of your product vision, right? That impacts velocity of research, right? Anyone who's worked in any complex topic or team, the vision, the process of that strategic planning is really messy and cross-functional. And so, but how does that impact the researcher? And I think for a long time, everything doubled down on the rigor and talent of the research team, which I felt was a little unbalanced. Yeah, the IC's talent and the ability to navigate that complexity is is valid, it's like yes, and we also have a lot more leaders sitting at the table and a lot more cross-functional people who in theory should be mature now at this point or when it comes to how to have how the product vision, how the organizational factors, the headwinds. Are you in the middle of a hurricane? Are you in the middle of a sunny days when you do your research? That adds complexity to it that needs to be measured over time and consistently so that you can get insight on how environmental factors influence the velocity before the researcher even gets started, right? The response measures. So like after environment, then you have your traditional project measures, which I feel like is just everywhere. So I won't really go into that. But which study, the type of study, it's like describing and illustrating and painting the research study and execution, which is great. After it's done, this is where I'm saying it gets a little spicy, right? The response measures, like what was just the reaction of your stakeholders? I mean, let's just take the design, primary stakeholders like design and product, right? That even gets a little juicy. What was the reaction there? What was the response there? Was it crickets or was it some ongoing follow-up? What were the venue? Where were the places that you presented, right? Throughout my career, I've seen things land in an email and it was like, we're done. And I'm like, are we done? Are we? That's it. And so I think a lot of us got in saying like, no, they, especially from certain social sciences, got here to advocate. But that process and that journey has, you hear things. I've heard so many different rumors. I feel like we can write a book about the number of assumptions we make about research. But I've heard things like, well, research should just be, we're just informing. We don't really want to push. We're just informing, and it kind of minimizes. It's like, yeah, we can inform, but can we do anything more? And how is that response, right? So the response measures, like where did you, present these findings, and what was the reaction from the stakeholders over time? It's not just one-off, but I'm talking about like a portfolio over time. Decision and risk measures. We're probably already tracking decision, but are we tracking risk? What's the risk of not making that decision? So yes, there was a number of insights. There were one or two that got implemented. And sometimes I think we double down on those small wins, as we always talk. What about the small losses? Let's talk about that, right? Like, what about those other 9 or 10 insights that didn't get decided on? What were the impacts of that? And then collaboration measures. So this is again where it gets a little spicy, right? What was the quality of that collaboration? You can almost double down into collaboration maturity or collaboration intelligence in and of itself, because research field is such a highly collaborative discipline. I'm surprised we don't have massive amounts of, metrics already around what contributes to a quality collaboration. You see so much chatter on LinkedIn about do this in your presentation, do that, which is all valid. I think these are all great. I just think in some complex, wicked problem flower areas, putting a quiz or a warm and fuzzy quote in the beginning of a presentation design just might not be enough to get that sticky insight stick, and it's just the reality. And so I think when we double down on these things that are nice to have in our collaboration, or, a lot of people talk about work, relationships. Throughout my career, while I definitely think that working relationships and business relationships in any context are important and critical for building trust, there's boundaries. There's certain aspects, and this is where I got motivated from my aviation and space, where I don't think anyone cared about the quality of your relationship. They wanted to know, can you build this machinery or not, right? The quality of relationships matter. However, to what extent is it helping to land those insights is the working relationship boundary. And I get a little concerned, quite honestly, when I see across the industry where we double down on this. It's almost as if we're establishing a dating relationship between stakeholders. And I just want to remind people you're working and you have an outcome to it, and we need to put those boundaries there. So having a baseline on what equals a team that has high collaboration because of how it landed critical must-have insights like safety and inclusion, not just because it landed 1 or 2 recommendations. That's not, to me, the intelligence I'm talking about. That's describing projects. But if you capture things like environment, response, decision, risk, collaboration over time, you could start then bringing in that critical perspective that I feel like is missing around, okay, what is the impact of us not, of this being bad? If another direct, I've seen because research doesn't necessarily have this standardized governing body the way engineering does, especially engineering and aviation. Like there's a standard even within governments, right? It can kind of vary. And so a lot of teams, even leaders, need support on what is good? What does it look like? Because I think it's great, or I'm stuck in a, tunnel vision through how we execute on how we do this, not knowing that another team may be setting a higher bar on, what it means to have collaboration with stakeholders and what it means to have them respond. Why not have that a bit more broad and a bit more transparent with data? And this is how we beef up, gathering that baseline and showing people across is how we level up our field beyond just consuming, the state of maturity.
Yeah. No, totally. I love that. I think there's a lot of consuming. Like it doesn't help anyone. I mean, it kind of helps a little to be told, like, you're in this level, you're in this stage, but like, what next? What do you do with that? Like, and there's so much nuance that's really hard to capture in a simple, like 5 stages. Like, how do you address all the differences and all, like you said, that organizational, like environmental differences and factors. So love that. I think those are all super actionable. And I think as an industry, we want action. Like we want steps. We don't just want like flowery, like this is what you should do, or high level thoughts, which is lovely. Like I'm all for that. But people just want to know what do I do? Speaking of like action, so success metrics, I feel like we're all talking about KPIs. We all want to know, like, what should we be tracking? How do we show that impact? So I'm curious how you think research teams can move beyond just those traditional success metrics, or maybe metrics that work for other teams in an organization, and deliver more strategic insights. What can they kind of do?
Yeah, so I think this is where the conversation has to go inward. Someone can tell you from the outside, and there's a number of reasons why people do that. At the end of the day, you need to go internal. This is a critical reflection type of approach that turns the lens onto yourself, your positionality as a researcher. So you could do it, as an individual project, but it's better when it's like a workshop, a team offsite where you guys actually map out your insights. In fact, start at the report. Don't start at the beginning or in the middle or with design. Like just start with your research reports. Where do your insights go? Map that across. And if you don't know, that's where you need to start with the number of KPIs, because you need to start tracking it. That means that ultimately metrics and measures and all that stuff just adds visibility, right? And so if you can't answer that question of where your insights go, that means you need more visibility. And McKinsey has a great article about, are you asking enough from your design leaders? If you as an individual researcher or a team can't answer that question, do you think corporate leaders and design leaders know where your insights are if you don't? And so getting in the workshop and leveraging that journey map process that we all know so well for our users, do that for ourselves and our insights and see where they go. And wherever those gaps are in that journey, that becomes where you need to brainstorm kind of the KPIs and measures related to environmental response, decision and risk, collaboration. And you can even scope it again to those meaty topics that I think everyone would agree on, right? Safety, trust, inclusion, a lot of those critical, and there could be more critical topics. These are just the ones I see across LinkedIn all the time. But getting a workshop and scoping it there is a great start, scoping it with measures that a lot of people can't disagree with across the company, or that's critical to the corporate or maturity or organizational maturity. And that's something that's really important too. When we talk about research maturity, it's always a siloed thing. And I'm like, so research, design, UX, all these strategies are within a mature organization. So wherever your corporate maturity is, I think it aligns, right? And so this is how these discussions or the output of that workshop and these measures can inform broader discussions around how mature a company is becoming, right? So yeah, capturing it over multiple quarters. I think this is just much, the way I've implemented it in the past has been in the context of a retrospective for both researchers as well as cross-functional folks, because I think research leaders need to have that broad perspective, not only what my team is feeling, but the perception of this from the partners, right? And if there's gaps there in that, or expectations on what you do with your insights. I've talked to a number of stakeholders over my career, and they all vary on what they think their role should be with those insights, right? It's like it shouldn't vary. We should have a clear playbook on what the role of the primary stakeholder, executive stakeholders, even executives at the company. All that should be clear. And I think that helps support the researcher leaders or research decision makers with their strategy. So I've implemented it in the context of a retro so that it's also safe. That's why also people from the outside, it's hard to just tell you what to do because it's not a safe space. I don't know your team, right? But like bringing it in also, I think, helps research leaders get a pulse check too. So if you already have team surveys, offsites, things like that, retros, hopefully you do have a retrospective because it's also helpful, or even postmortem. So when things go bad, right? Engineering culture always has that. Like when I came over to UX, I'm like, okay, something failed. We're going to talk about it, right?
Yeah.
The idea of failure in UX, or what I felt in UX research, was a lot different than failure in the engineering and definitely aviation culture. It was an opportunity to learn. And so developing that growth mindset within UX research to say that this didn't land the way I thought it should land, but also reflect on why not, and have that courageous conversation supports the researchers as they move through these different, research leaders, as they move through those different decision-making tables. Because the thing with the seat at the table thing we talk about, there's multiple seats at the table. I don't, like for organizations that are super complex and wicked powers, I wish there was one seat at the table that I could sit at, but you can't. And that's why I think that we need those more nuanced roles like senior researchers moving over into these kind of strategic support systems to sit at the table as well, because they have the tools. A lot of senior plus researchers have that business understanding and know how to navigate those relationships because they did all that relationship building, right? The way I moved over to it was from a team that had already established. So I went from leading a team to taking on more operational strategic support system work versus the people management. So I already had those relationships, which help. It's like now leverage them to have some of those meaty conversations after you get all this data back about the gaps in your strategy.
Totally. You gave me the perfect segue into my next question. What kind of do you see as the most significant challenges people may face in moving from a UX research role into that more strategic role?
Oh yeah, that's the juicy part. That's the part that you mentioned. I talk about this in advancing research as well, about my journey with all these different pivots in computer science, engineering, UX, anthropology at one point, which is probably the hardest one to pivot to, technical engineering to social inquiry, and then research operations. In all of them, there was this identity, I guess, professional identity that we hold very dear to our heart. I think more so within research and UX. Engineering, not so much. I felt like there was a lot of like as many hats, all hands on deck type of thing. It's easy to switch between roles. But those boundaries of identity kind of are where the biggest challenge. So while there's a gap, there's also other roles in UX ops, and leadership has a lot of expectations on what they should and should not do. The thing is, you guys, we have a ton of leaders, and we said hire as many decision makers as we can across the industry, but we can't do it all. Kate talks about this all in her book too, so please read more in Kate's book, but you can't stretch people thin. Kate also used to talk about Kate Townsend is who I'm talking about too, if you guys don't know. We're obsessed with
Kate.
artists. Yes, Kate. So I remember early on in her career, she kept saying, don't move the operational challenges around because it's just moving inefficiencies around. And I just want to be like 100. Oh my gosh. I was like, because as I moved between them, it was almost as if folks were saying, oh, you want to take on the work that I don't want to do. It's like, no, if you look at your strategy as a whole, you haven't actually solved anything. You just moved it to this person. Now you have to think strategically about what that role is. So role and responsibility documents to talk through and debate about. I think it also leads to a lot of juicy debate. Like, oh, I think this is not even research, right? This is something that's outside of research. Why would we care about, enforcing those insights or gathering these metrics? And it's like, why wouldn't we care? And it's like, oh, we have UX ops. Well, is UX ops focused on research, or is it focusing on strengthening the research between design relationship for product decisions. So I think the way we scoped these roles initially helps us with establishing research. But when I'm talking about going beyond maturity and intelligence and future product landscapes, we're going to have to think a little bit differently about the boundaries there and how we establish them. I think that was probably one of the hardest challenges I experienced, just going through those different roles. It's just almost feeling like you're stepping on people's toes, or, trying to find how this role can help those different teams is a healthy challenge. But it is a challenge. Challenging the status quo is also a big one that came out pretty juicy. I think, again, I've had this point of view for 15 plus years, so bear with me. When I started these questions, it was very much why are we challenging something that isn't broken, right? We have jobs, we're doing research, we're executing. Why do we even have to talk about, the collaboration and the decision making? It's because how do you know if something is broken if you don't measure it, right? How do you know where the gaps are? Ignoring it is almost as irresponsible as not doing anything about it. And so challenging that status quo of this is not my job, or this is someone else's job, or it is the IC's job. I hear a lot of that. That's the individual IC's job, and the socialization and communication to, measure where their insights are. It's like, yeah, if we weren't on to, most ICs are already on to their next study. So the reality of that just isn't as practical as it sounds, especially when you also have leadership and you also have these senior level individuals who have tools that can be used for it. So just challenging the status quo of how we carve out our research roles. There's also this huge thing that I've experienced around negativity bias. It's just, I also think that's healthy. It's part of maturing. If you think about it, again, if you go back to the idea of maturity, intelligence, and wisdom, you go through some negative aspects in life. You don't get to maturity, a mature state in life, without going through a few hardships, right? So calling out those hardships, though, unfortunately, for a number of factors, even as you get into the different layers of cultural bias, and when it comes to research, the stuff that Vivian Costello talks about a lot, right? You get hit with a lot of, you are being negative. It's like, or you are blaming someone or complaining. And it's like, but it's just data, right? Like if it's data driven and it's done in a corporately responsible way, it's in the best interest for everyone. Again, if you do scope it to those meaty, must-have critical insights that touch on things that are important for everyone at the company to be a part of, it's baked in your company values. Is it really negative, or is it really just growth?
Yeah.
You can look at a lot of parts of it. So that's that growth mindset, perspective when it comes to the difficult aspects of our role that isn't just complaining, it's just forcing us to have the growth mindset to grow with that. So I think challenging the status quo, navigating the negativity bias, that you're not complaining, that you're showing data driven. You could do that through pilots, by the way. That was the strategy I learned. Just pilot it, find a champion, pilot it, then bring people the data. So then it kind of bypasses a little bit of the negativity bias. But to be quite frank, bias is such a huge part of being a human that it's going to be there anyway. So just even checking in with yourself and knowing how to navigate that is important. Boundaries, professional boundaries, professional identity, or broadening the perspective of what research is, what research ops is, strategic research operations, and what our research can become is really important. But they are really big challenges, and depending on the context and politics and the individual, they can be mountains to get over. So having great support systems for this effort is important. And I always look to mentors that are just a strategy in life, that are 1 or 2 levels above me, that are in other fields. So a lot of mentors, like I said, from business operations have mentored me on this, who are director level business ops people, just give me a different vantage point. Leaders that I work with, research leaders, they always give me that vantage point of executives, and they're, again, advancing research, has a few research executives who give really interesting perspectives of their journey as well. But yeah, those are probably the biggest challenges, and the skill sets that need to be gained. I think researchers can actually look outside of research. So there's some tools within research that I think you can sharpen, like um, critical organizational theory, organizational culture. Enterprise UXers have a ton of, I think, of these tools already. But then there's tools outside that you can sharpen that are around, business negotiation, influencing without authority, understanding mature operations. I think sales ops and engineering ops are really great examples of this strategic support system. In fact, we feel it in our own practice sometimes. We feel these strategic support systems from our partners at us, because I'm pretty sure a number of researchers have had an incident where where research feels like a block support system, giving someone data around the velocity of engineering or sales or anything like that. We need that same type of, I think, support system so that when we hear those reasons, we have data to say, no, actually, this is what's happening. And that's just the reality of the situation. It doesn't have to be negative. Again, it can be a form of growth and intelligence. So
Amazing. Yeah. I love the idea of like looking to other ops teams, not just for mentorship. I love that idea, finding a mentor in business ops or in another ops role, but also looking at other ops teams as well. I think that's awesome. So wanting to briefly touch on collaboration, because we've talked a little about it, you have some spicy takes. I'd love to hear what trends, future trends you see in research collaboration that will impact how research teams operate.
Well, I think the work that Kate has done and Emma and the research ops community, that trend itself is probably the biggest shift in this strategic support system that I hope continues, because like I said in the beginning, it makes us visible. She talks about systems and how it informs strategic priorities in the book. It started to make those systems visible when we have more people working on it. So hopefully that continues, zooming into those researcher workflows. It all just sets the right foundation to get to this level that I'm talking about. I think the new trends in new senior level, even executive roles, has been great. I've looked across the industry. I think ServiceNow has the chief of staff of research. That's just really great to see, because that means that executive perspective of strategic support systems is being considered. So hopefully we'll see even more of those executive director level research operations or research program roles, new champions for insights. Again, earlier I talked about we've already started the trend of getting champions for research. If you remember early on, that was like our mission. We got to get champions outside of research. The number of people who are asking for research outside of research, right? But we were mostly talking about design and product, or maybe sales and marketing, right? Our friends. And so what about other teams like compliance and inclusion? I think we'll start to see teams that are really interested at a corporate level at why or why not some of these juicy, meaty topics, even political topics, aren't making it across the company at a faster rate, and the impact that's having at a corporate level. And the design execution isn't going anywhere. I just want to mention, because I know I talk a lot about this and I always reflect but I don't mention a lot, but I'm not saying we should get rid of the design perspective or we shouldn't even stop at some point. We still need experts who are covering the usability of our products in a very meaningful, even strategic way, like benchmarking and things like that. So I think that is covered. I guess I'm saying as we move into the future and product landscapes and insights and strategic insights become even more critical, we'll need to beef up that advocacy and support systems beyond that. But we still should keep usability, that trend of supporting design execution there, because it is still quite critical. When people sit down, they see the UI, and that's where we need those experts at. So we'll have the same collaborators, but in the future, I think we'll have more nuanced collaborations and critical ones to the corporate.
Sure. Yeah. I love that you brought up like compliance teams. I think in a previous AMA, we had someone in the comments point out that like user research in some way can kind of lead the charge and be the example within an organization for things like compliance and ethics, because often researchers are leading this example of how do we interact with customers, and everyone in an org is interacting with customers. And I really love that point. And I really think it's empowering and true that researchers can lead the way in so many ways. And we can kind of lead the charge of this is the right way to do this. Like, this is how you should treat customer insights. This is how you should communicate with your customers. So I love that idea of building stronger relationships with legal, with ethics teams, with compliance. I love that you brought that up. I think that's super important and becoming more important, like you said. I'd love to, we're getting to 10 minutes, so if people have questions, start dropping them in the chat. But I'd love to quickly hear, I feel like I hear this a lot of how do you balance stakeholder needs, and there's a lot of emphasis on what is the stakeholder needs. So I want to know how you see balancing those stakeholder needs with maintaining like research integrity and ensuring strategic alignment. Do you have any tips or thoughts there?
Yeah. Stakeholder need, that's always going to be really tricky. I think we've actually, I want to believe in theory that through all the research maturity discussion and tips on how to navigate stakeholder management, that maybe, research leaders can handle that aspect. I think it's important. So I went to a conference, UX conference in San Francisco, and someone was talking about rotations and pivots in your work. I think that's setting up a culture where researchers can pivot between different roles in order to allow some time to have this critical reflection of integrity and practice is worthwhile. I think what I'm proposing is that advocating for that is good for everyone, right? I think research leaders, especially the best research leaders, have a great way of prioritizing the most critical information and even pushing back and giving people a positive no. It's like, what do you do with that extra bandwidth? My proposal is to create a culture where your researchers, especially senior level researchers, can partner with program managers and look at the integrity of the research findings a little bit more thoroughly. Whatever you do, don't squeeze it in. Kate also talks about that, right? I +1 to that. Stop squeezing these little projects into different roles because they honestly affect researcher morale, right? It needs to be a dedicated role, someone that can actually look across the research workflow and assess the situation. Start with the project tracker itself, right? Like bake it into the strategic planning. Like, hey, we're just gonna have, expand how we're tracking this study. And explain why. It's on it. When you talk about integrity, I just don't think anyone is going to debate that. It's like one of those things. Like, of course, we want integrity in our development process, and I just really believe that one of the beauties of having more research leaders is that we do have a heck of a lot more muscle to say no to certain things. So I don't think that that's the problem. If you still need help with that, there's tons of literature around how to do that, especially at the research ops community. But I think the question is, well, what do you do when you said no and you have additional resources? I think one way is to look at the intelligence of all the information you're tracking about your programs, and starting with that project tracker, expanding it to like a practice tracker. Instead of describing the projects, describe the research practice. And if multiple teams do this and multiple teams across a company do it, we're now getting into intelligence, and we can now critically reflect about the research practice instead of just describe the projects to a stakeholder here too,
Totally. Yeah. I really want to talk about the poll, but I wanted to pull up this comment from Abby, I think is just so great. She says, I think there's lots of opportunities for people in certain in-house roles to act as advocates and consultants to certain departments and areas and drive certain strategic level projects. So kind of what you're talking about. And again, I just love that. I think there's so much research can offer to an org that isn't just research and like those insights, like you said. So really love that from Abby. We have a poll running and there's some interesting comments in the chat. I'd love to pull it up and hear your thoughts on this one.
Then corporate operations came. I really thought that would be thought that would be lower because from my experience, and this is why I love this is the spiciness of this conversation, right? I've heard a lot of debate about where this should be. And the first thing I hear is within UXR. And it's like a UXR problem or a UXR challenge that UXR needs to solve. And I've always been strongly against that because I'm like, is integrity of the development process just a UXR issue? But I also love the fact that people think that corporate operations is a great place to do it because, again, we think about the trend of visibility from the research ops organization, reemergence of research operations, the visibility that research leaders have provided the research team. Now we need that intelligence about all that data, the decision makers, the cross-functional relationships. And once we make it visible to corporate, once you make that information visible at the corporate level, even the product level, now we're starting to have different conversations, right? We're starting to have different conversations about the practice of research and get different types of champion research. So we just can diversify the number of people who are rooting for our insights to land. So when we ask that first poll again next year, it's not, it's now 950. Where's your insights? You can go directly to a dashboard, know exactly where that is. Not only you, but your corporate operations as well, and have a little bit more enforcement and accountability on those insights. So it's not just that one lonely AC trying to prove their socialization strategy,
Yes, 100%. I want to share some interesting thoughts from the chat on this poll. So Stephanie said it depends. I think it should start in UX, then move to product ops. Once adopted more broadly, then expand out. It's kind of an interesting thought. And then Abby said, let's pull hers up quick. Could be sort of must be designed with the corporate strategy in mind. So very interesting there too, but cool to see.
So Stephanie's, I love that because, and I would recommend folks to kind of check out Melissa and Denise. They wrote, so check out Product Operations. They wrote a book about product operations, and there's bits of snippets around research operations, pulling in from the industry, from other research leaders. There could be something there, especially depending on the type of company, the scale. Product operations could be the corporate operation, the link between it, depending on the type. So I check out their book there because they give, and I'll link all this stuff later. I'm blanking on people's exact names.
All good. Yeah, we'll get the links out. Don't worry.
And Abby, I think, brought up a really great point. If you bring that up again. Yeah, so this is really interesting. This is what that McKinsey article, Are You Asking Enough from Your Design Leaders, talks about. I've always felt this as well across my career, that UX research strategy, it was, if you had one, if you were able to point to a formal UX strategy, not a, Kate also talks about this, like if you ask, back in the day, if you would ask someone about the UXR strategy, they point to like a product strategy or a designer's design strategy. And I'm like, no, where's the research strategy? That is a corporate strategy in and of itself. It's a business strategy, it's a formal strategy. And I'm not sure the design lens that established our wonderful discipline will be enough to advocate for the corporate strategy implications of research. I think it advocates for the design strategy, again, which is great. It's like, yes, and where's the aspects that inform to how wise a company becomes because of the research strategy. Like, that's a very beautiful thing. And if you break it down to actual metrics and data, I think it could be quite interesting way to get visibility from the top of the company.
Absolutely. I want to just end. So there's so much. I mean, we could go for another 2 hours, I feel, but Andrew, we have one last comment here that I just think is great. I want to just throw this up on the screen, see what you think. Just toss another thought in there.
Well, yeah, I love that because that is what I'm hoping when we talk about like trends of the future. I'm hoping that we, similar to Nalini's talk at Advancing Research, just get more executives and leaders talking about that transition of a research strategy from supporting design to supporting corporate, because there are tons of companies already doing this. I just don't have time to go through all of them, but maybe one ask is for our field to start elevating that in the comments and the chatter. Democratization is great. Let's see another democratization conversation. Like, that's great, but can we talk a little bit about the executive experiences that are happening now that we have so many decision makers moving their research strategy in these different shapes and sizes? Some of them are in corporate strategy already. Some of them are in product strategy. What is that like, and what is the baseline, and how is it helping, or how is it not? There's more chatter, and elevating and amplifying that, I think, moves us, bringing it back to the topic, from that research maturity consumption only, like look at what level you're at and what level you're not, to the research intelligence. Look at how these executives, were able to impact a company because of how they moved across different aspects of organizational structure.
Absolutely. I feel like I'm going to catch myself later in this whole chat just nodding the entire time. I'm snapping. We have 1 minute left, and I just want to end with asking, like, based on the insights you've shared, your perspective, what would be your call to action to the research industry, or call to action, like calls to action?
Yeah, I think, I think creating a culture, one that not only allows people to pivot into this different role, because one thing I have to give gratitude to my research managers that I've all worked with that allowed me to navigate this role. So, but they had to create a culture for that, learning and how it benefits to do these rotations, but also creating a culture where researchers, when you go through these retrospectives and you go through assessing research practice, they can tell you about those nuanced experience besides project status. Like, is it complete? Is it not complete? I've always had so much to say after being asked that. Like, yeah, it's complete, but I had a really, interesting journey. And so creating a culture where researchers feel safe to talk about collaboration, decision making, politics, the back and forth that goes after you do that research report is really important. Would probably, and then go read Kate's book. So Kate is not paying me. I'm just but I build on a lot of those topics and reflections from my advancing research 2024. But she just sets a really great foundation in the book. And some of those things, if you haven't even addressed some of those, you might not even want to bring up this topic of intelligence. Just come back to it later. So first, read Kate's book and create a culture where people feel safe to talk about everything in between what you're tracking in that project, because that's also important. And it may be even important to the company.
Amazing. I just want to end with like snapping like crazy. Everyone, we will be sharing the recording out. First, Fatimah, this has been amazing. Like I said, we could have gone for like 3 more hours. I'm just brimming with insights and questions, but we will definitely be sharing a recording and a recap. And definitely, I'll also share all the links Fatimah said, and check her out on LinkedIn. Keep the conversation going. You can also keep chatting in this chat after we end. So definitely keep sharing your thoughts. But thank you so much. This has been amazing, super important conversation. I really appreciate the time.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And thanks everyone for listening in. I hope you have a great day.
Yes.
Stress-free day.
Yes, stress-free. And again, keep the conversations going. Check her out on LinkedIn. We'll share all the links and everything you need to know. So thanks so much, everyone. Have a good rest of your day. See ya.